Well, hello and welcome back to our debates. We have here, of course, Chris Robertshaw, retired MHK, now a political pundit, and particularly we are talking about the Dr Ranson business. I was last on camera reading out my FOI. I think that was last time we talked about this, or I did my piece about it. You've had a chance to look at that, because we kept that back until we had a response. I think it was important, though, to get that in the public domain, to explain or try to show people where we're going with this. If I just say at the beginning of this whole thing, all these FOIs, and I've been very well briefed, by the way, it's way above my pay scale, this whole thing, but it's more what they don't tell you. They say they've got something, but they won't release it. Actually helps us immensely, because then therefore we know there is information out there. But under this sort of style of government, the process has been incredibly difficult, really quite unexplainably. So when freedom of information is the right of the public to have this information, unless there's a very good reason for not giving it. But if anyone's followed the actions we've done with these freedom of informations, it's been blocked constantly. I mean, it's just quite strange. No, it's not even strange. It's actually becoming quite normal to be blocked. But this is the question I really want to just pose, is that, is this the way the government of the Isle of Man should be behaving itself with now the freedom of information? I mean, this came in your era, didn't it? The actual
No, I brought it in.
You brought it in? Well, I didn't know that. Yeah. I mean, if we hadn't got that, where would we be with this whole thing?
In a hopeless position. The concept of the proper use of FOI's got to move on somewhat, and this in many respects is the biggest test that this Act has had. They're not living up to what they should be doing, in my view. And this will be personal to some degree, because it's now got to the point when it's hard to be completely just in the middle of this whole thing, because clearly there is work at hand by people in power to stop this thing getting out. And I don't know if they can now. I believe it's too big for that, don't you? Well, if you stand back from this, I mean, right the way through the many, many sessions you and I have now done, we've constantly emphasised the fact that this is not going to go away. And the more there is a determination to suppress it or create an environment that there's nothing to see here, the worse it seems to get. And I have sort of, in recent weeks particularly, come to the conclusion that the only way that this is ultimately going to be resolved is more or less a process of truth and reconciliation, rather than this pretense and posturing and dodging and delaying and deflecting, and then pretending that they're fixing things when in fact, well, they're not. But what I'd like to do, if I may, Paul, is pick up on your last single presentation to the camera, where you talked about that FOI and that long, complicated one. And I was pleased you did that, very pleased, because up to now, we have quite understandably focused almost entirely on the awful situation that Rosalind Ranson found herself in. But there's a big story behind this that hasn't been addressed, and it starts with Abbotswood. That's where I commence my focus and concern about it. And I'd just like to sort of say a few words about that, if I may.
Sure.
And the reason I've chosen this particular moment is that I have spoken to Zandra Preston.
And
she was the boss of Abbotswood. Now, by describing what Zandra and I discussed, it shows very, very clearly, without hesitation or doubt, that this treatment of Rosalind Ranson isn't in isolation. This is a deep cultural issue. So let me just take you through it, and most of this you'll know, but you'll recall that soon after the awful deaths at Abbotswood, the balloon went up in a very big way, and as you, I think, said in your last presentation, that ex-Pol were brought in. And then Zandra Preston went through the most horrendous year under the threat of criminal charges. There was sub judice placed on Tynwald. It was shut down. It was as if government was saying, we're dealing with this is serious, stay away from it. A whole year went by, At the end of that year, there were no charges, 0 charges, criminal charges raised. But you may recall that at that time, and I think strangely enough it was the police who announced it, that there wouldn't be criminal charges, but there would be health and safety charges. Another further year went by wherein Zandra Preston was subject to an enormous amount of pressure, a second year of the most horrendous pressure. The 2 years put together I can only describe as relentless persecution of an individual, such that that person, and I think this is a matter of public knowledge, she on I think 2 occasions went close to suicide. It was that dreadful. What was the outcome? We now know what the outcome of all of that was. That sub judice in Tynwald, so nobody could speak about it. The public kept away because there was a strong suggestion of criminal charges. Then a further year of health and safety charges. What was the end result? The end result was simply that she was given a warning over the fact that on one occasion she was outside of her place of work for a period of 2 hours, and the other charge raised against her, the other small matter, was the matter of she didn't fill a form in correctly. So this woman, Zandra Preston, went through 2 years of absolute unmitigated hell, at the end of which there was next to nothing to present for all the efforts of government. So why did the government pursue this ex-poll investigation, threat of criminal charges, and so on and so forth, which I've just gone through twice already? I believe it was because they were trying to suppress the whole matter, keep the public away from it, keep Tynwald away from it. Now, Zandra's slowly recovering now. I mean, her business was destroyed, her health was destroyed, her career was destroyed. Doesn't it sound like Rosalind Ranson? And she hadn't got anything like the BMA behind her, as fortunately Rosalind did. But I think it's important that the public know that this is not an end to the matter. And if government think that, then they are sadly mistaken, because Zandra is, and I'm allowed to say this, Zandra is waiting to the end of the independent review that Kate is currently
the KC.
The KC.
Yeah.
It should be complete. It'll be
Brenner.
completed by Christmas. It's Kate Brenner.
Yeah.
Thank you. And after that, she is going to come out and tell her story in public, and I hope that you will.
I'll be interested.
You'll be part of that, because it is horrendous. There are things that I know went on because just as I picked up with Rachel Glover and Rosalind Ranson, I also picked up early doors with Zandra Preston. And there is a dreadful story to tell, and it must come out into the public arena.
Well,
part of it is. Do you want to ask a question?
No,
now?
I was going to make just a comment really, that it's the government's playbook, as I'd call it, and it worked the first time round. Bring in this independent company, to the export people, threaten all sorts of things with sub judice, and yet there was nothing, I don't think, for ages in front of the courts, but this whole thing, and that's exactly what they did with this Dr Ranson thing, didn't they? They went to Expol to do a report. At the same time, no one seemed to be able to talk about anything, and that's a playbook. That's oh, we did it before, we'll do it again, and that just comes up when you tell me it like that.
Well, yes, I mean, we've already seen that a whole cadre of very, very senior officers in government lost their integrity, and as a consequence they moved out of government, albeit with settlements. But Bernie Moffat's comment that he made about government's loss of humanity leaves us with a situation where senior government people have lost their integrity, they've lost their humanity, and they've lost their decency.
And these are people, in some cases, still in position, of course.
In some cases, yeah.
Because, I mean, some were let go,
Yeah.
however you want to word it. Certainly they weren't fired. That never came into it. They were
Well, no, some of them were praised, if you remember.
There was, and I mentioned that as well, that actually
You
people were patting them on the back to thank them for the work they'd done, which seems almost remarkable. But the main players, some of them are still in place, and I've named them. And this is really more concerning than anything, is that it's a year ago since Alf Cannon first apologised in Tynwald, and he said he did a year to get things altered. Yes. Mr. Coldrick made a video to all the staff members saying he needs time and to reassure everyone and things will change. But the problem is, it looks to an outsider that nothing has changed, and the government course is still to deflect, deny and bury, if possible, what's going on. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen because people are watching these videos more and more. And thank you to everyone who's subscribing to the channel, because that's really important, because it proves that there's a need for this sort of discussion, which other media are not doing it necessarily as much, but it's not going to go away, right?
Well, now, let me just pick up on that point you raised about Caldrick Randall's presentation to the 8,000 or so government staff.
This YouTube video, which has resurfaced, hasn't it?
Yeah, well, I've got one or two comments to make about that. If you listen carefully, he as the Chief Secretary, is suggesting that the social media, I mean, to some extent, I suppose he's referring to us. I can't see it.
We're not mainstream in that sense. We're online, so yeah.
That somehow government was being treated unfairly, and that he embraced in his video the entirety of government staff, as if somehow we are antagonistic towards people in the public service.
Well, it's quite inflammatory and misplaced.
And nothing is further from the truth. Yeah. The fact of the matter is that I, for one, am deeply concerned about the intent, and we've just discussed it, decency, integrity and humanity of the leadership in government. It is they who have misbehaved. It is they who have failed. And if anybody thinks for 1 minute that Caldrick Randall was right in suggesting that we're antagonistic towards the public service as a whole, he is completely and utterly wrong. And he tried to mislead government staff at that point. It's the leadership, including him, because he's involved in this as well, that the focus should be on forensically until the truth is out. And the best way to deal with it, as we've said before just a few minutes ago, is have a period of truth and reconciliation and get it out. Stop trying to hide. It's not working. The Abbotswood matter was, as you said in your presentation to the camera, the start of this in many respects, because it can never be proven. But let's just go back to what Rosalind Ranson was trying to do at that time. She hadn't been long in post. The COVID crisis was coming charging down the road, and she knew well, very, very well indeed, that our hospital was not ready to deal with it. And what Rosalind Ranson was trying to do in getting the borders closed on that fateful Friday the 13th, was to try to diminish or hold back the tide long enough to get the hospital in order. It wasn't about trying to shut the world down. It was trying to, as it were, keep the Isle of Man going internally while the health service got the hospital in good order. That's what she was trying to achieve. And that's what she wasn't listened to about. And you raised it in your, you're waiting for, you've still got nothing more, have you, on your FOIs?
No, I'll come to that later when we come to that part of it. But yeah, they're still waiting.
Well, the point being there is that, and I followed it, I picked it up as quickly as I could in the year 2021, where I had Rosalind in front of the Public Accounts Committee, as I did with Rachel Glover. And look at the treatment she got, for goodness sake.
Yeah. So I've got the dates here. So DHS, the Department for Home Affairs, answered a little bit. That's the one we used, but answered, but didn't. They said they had something, but they couldn't release it. But then, anyway, the DHS went to the 16th. They want more time, and the DHSC one more time, but won't give me a date.
Do you remember once the body corporate, the government's bureaucracy and leadership had decided no, they weren't going to close the borders. And the nefarious activities went on enormously in that weekend. But do you not remember that ultimately, by the time the virus had got in, and we were getting close to a decision that the border had to be closed by those very people who'd refused it days before, I recall, I'm not wrong surely, around about that time the Chief Minister said he had not had medical advice to the effect that the borders should be closed. But he had. Now, was that the degree to which the officers on the weekend of the Friday the 13th and Monday the 16th refused to display the facts of the Rosalind Ranson's presentation, which he'd put together, and it was a detailed presentation, and made a very strong case? Had the officers so completely kept that information away from the Chief Minister that he had no idea at all that his Chief Medical Officer was saying, for goodness sake, close the borders? Now, I'm not sure of the date when the Chief Minister said in public, and I'm not sure whether it was a media interview, that he said he hadn't had medical advice to the effect that the borders should be closed.
We're talking about the gatekeepers, as I'm referring to them as, right? These civil servants who looked at what was given to them by Ranson. They then made, allegedly, still to use that, but I know it's more than that because I've seen what's going on. So we have the DHA...
Well, it's allegedly in the sense that...
Well, I'm just covering myself, because who knows where we're going to end with this.
Well,
so Gatekeepers,
okay.
Department of Home Affairs, well, it's Dan Davis. DHSC is Maxon. The Treasury is Coldrick Randall. And DFE is Mark Lewin. All those people were, peers, had seen the Ranson version on that weekend, presented to the department, to the Comin, was a completely, well, I'm using the word carefully, watered down version of what she'd said. And you do wonder that beforehand, that did the minister Ashford see the original on the Friday, and then on the Monday, whenever Comin saw it, he saw then the watered down version. Yes, and if he did, would he not have raised some sort of alarm that it's been changed?
No, because if you remember, he was completely in the thrall of Catherine Manson, and Catherine Manson was the controlling mind in terms of following UK process. Yeah. And so David Ashford, even though he knew much to the better that there was a serious medical presentation. We also remember that the boss on the civil service at the time was Will Greenhow, who's no longer there. So he's really right at the top of this, but gone. But will he be giving evidence? We'll come on to that maybe later. But from the freedom of information, we do now know there was a toned down email sent. That's even though they won't tell us, we can work that one out before they won't tell us. So a toned down email. There was a lot in Rosalind Ranson's PAC session, which was about 3 hours long, as I recall. At the time, it was not to be published, but ultimately the PAC produced a report towards the end of the Parliament. It was never that PAC report was not debated per se, but Rosalind Ranson made the position absolutely clear as to, in that PAC session, what had and had not happened, and it's very enlightening reading if you have the chance to go through it. We're going to take a break just have a think about this. We're going to have more sections, maybe one, who knows, but do stay tuned for more on this. And we should say that this coming week is another tribunal. This coming week, Dr Ranson is back there because, in a sense, she got fired twice. We'll try and explain a bit about that. So I don't know everything, but we know that there's a tribunal coming on. So join us for part 2.